I believe time is running out, that it is just 30 seconds before midnight and the greatest financial crisis in history is just around the corner. In this video, I'm going to show you why it's going to be the greatest financial crisis in history. The Federal Reserve is bankrupt. They went bankrupt in September of 2022, and they've been running on fumes ever since. But they no longer make a profit, and since September of 2022, they are so bankrupt that they have been writing IOUs to the U.S. Treasury. Now I'm going to show you the mechanics behind this so that everybody understands it and explain that everything changed with Bernankenomics. In 2008, the monetary system in the United States and a whole bunch of other central banks around the world did the same thing, the quantitative easing. This fundamentally changed the monetary system. I call it Bernankenomics. And this is the reason that the next crisis is going to be the greatest crisis in history. So in this, there's 4 charts here. And I've got these charts animated, and they're all synchronized, so they're on the same timeline. And you're going to see this go throughout time. And it starts in 2005, just so you can see that the member banks of the Federal Reserve System never needed any more than $40 to $50 billion of bank reserves for everything to operate smoothly. In fact, they still don't. They could probably get by with 40 to 50, maybe 60 billion in bank reserves, and everything would still run smoothly. Now, I have to explain real quick that bank reserves are one of the 3 forms of U.S. dollars that exist. There are 2 forms of base currency. Base currency is what the Federal Reserve creates. One form, the primary form is Federal Reserve notes, currency in circulation, the paper dollars that are in our wallets that you can go to the bank and withdraw if you want and stick in your wallet. And that's the currency that we are familiar with that the Federal Reserve creates. The other currency the Federal Reserve creates, we've never seen. It's bank reserves. It only exists in checking accounts at the Federal Reserve that all of the member branches have with the Federal Reserve. And at the end of every day, all of the member banks do settlement. They pay each other, they borrow, they lend to each other at the end of every day through those checking accounts that are at the Federal Reserve. But the point is that these are a special dollar that does not ever get out into circulation. You've never seen one. You've never used one. It doesn't exist in your checking account. I've never seen one. So that is a separate monetary system that exists only between the banks and the Federal Reserve. This chart over here is interest on reserves. You'll notice that it's at 0. Why? Because the reserves, the banks didn't want any more than they needed. It was considered a liability because it didn't pay interest. And so up until 2008, this will stay at 0. Now, in the Federal Reserve System, in the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, it states that the Federal Reserve can only buy assets through the open market. And they are restricted to assets that are guaranteed as to the principal and the interest by the U.S. government, you, the taxpayer. It's got to be guaranteed by you. And that meant, until 2008, exclusively U.S. treasuries. Now, in the Federal Reserve Act, it also states that since the Federal Reserve is buying U.S. treasuries, the Federal Reserve makes a profit. There's interest paid on those treasuries. At the end of every week, the Federal Reserve is supposed to pay their member banks the 6% dividend. All the banks of the Federal Reserve System are members of the system, and they have to buy stock in the Federal Reserve when they join the Federal Reserve System. And the Federal Reserve is supposed to pay them their 6% dividend. That's in the Federal Reserve Act. And then they deduct their own expenses, the Federal Reserve's expenses, and then they pay whatever is left over to the Treasury. So they don't get to keep that profit. They pay it to the U.S. Treasury. Now what that does is the U.S. Treasury adds it to the general fund, it pays down the general fund. So it offsets the deficits that we are running just a little bit. So if they don't receive those payments, then the Treasury has to issue more bills, bonds, and notes, treasuries, to make up for the difference. Now, what no other newsletter writer, commentator, or economist that I know of has done is, I had my researchers, Alan Hibbard, created this chart down here. All of this is data that is downloaded from the Federal Reserve, but nobody has taken the bank reserves times the interest on the reserves and calculated how many dollars have been paid to the banks of those primary dealers, the largest brokerage houses on earth. They all have a corresponding bank. The bank has an account at the Federal Reserve. The brokerage house does not. The Federal Reserve can't actually pay the brokerage house directly. You're going to see the mechanics of that in a moment. So let's fire up this chart, and you're going to see time go by, and you'll notice that they don't need any more than $40 to $50 billion. 2006, 2007, along comes the financial crisis of 2008, and bam, Ben Bernanke starts doing quantitative easing. Now, in quantitative easing, he's trying to inject currency that is created by the Federal Reserve directly into the economy. And to do that, he's buying massive quantities of U.S. treasuries, and with the nationalization of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac just before the crisis of 2008, as though they had anticipated this, mortgage-backed securities. But those products are purchased from the brokerage houses, and they can't actually pay the brokerage houses. They have to pay the brokerage houses' bank. They're separate entities. A bank cannot be a primary dealer, but all primary dealers have a bank. And so that gets paid into the bank reserves. But to keep those bank reserves from causing problems in the economy, bank reserves, they don't come out into the general economy, but they can cause inflation through other processes. There are things that the banks can do with them. So to keep the banks from using them in a method that would cause massive inflation, Ben Bernanke decided for the first time in history that we're going to pay interest on those reserves. And there were unforeseen consequences that has led, the Federal Reserve is now in a trap. And you're going to see that they are bankrupt, and it is because of this idea, because of Bernankenomics. And the walls are closing in. And Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve are in that trap, but so are you and I. And then, but nobody has calculated, if you take this, the bank reserves, times the interest rate, you can calculate this. It's all based off of Federal Reserve numbers. And so you can calculate the free currency that rains down on banks. As we increase the amount of reserves, QE, it's raining free currency. But then when we raise interest rates, it is a deluge that just falls on those banks of free currency. And you'll see here in the upcoming videos on this that as this is given to the banks, there's less left over to give to the Treasury, meaning that it's coming out of your pocket because it's not reducing the deficits. So this data starts in 2011. Now, I've got to digress a little bit. In November of 2002, Ben Bernanke gave a speech that really changed the world. It was called Deflation, Making Sure It Doesn't Happen Here. And in there, he laid out a complete roadmap of all the things that he could do if we have a crisis and we reach what's called the zero bound. If we take interest rates down to zero, you can't take them very negative because people will just take cash out of the bank and put it in a safe. Deflation, making sure it doesn't happen here, was a roadmap to the future. Everything that I did I discovered it in about 2005. But what's interesting is in October, 1 month before this speech, was when I first started buying gold, getting ready for what I saw coming. Because of this speech, I knew what was going to happen in 2008. I was warning people that there was one of the greatest crises in history coming at us, that it was not just going to be a stock market crash like back in 2001, 2002, that it was also going to be a huge real estate crash, a crisis. And that is exactly what happened. So here are the mechanics of it. This is the system used for quantitative easing and regular old open market operations. Quantitative easing is just a name for open market operations on steroids. It's huge. But the Federal Reserve is going to inject currency directly into the economy by purchasing bonds from the primary dealers. There's 18 to 30 of these primary dealers at any given time, and if they buy $1 billion worth of bonds from J.P. Morgan or Bank of America Securities, B of A Securities, at the same time, what they do is they create the currency to pay for those. They type $1 billion of Federal Reserve IOUs into existence, and they pay the bank. But this bank, you've got to imagine the bank as though it has, here's the front of the bank, here's the back of the bank. There's a wall in the middle. In the front of the bank, you or I can walk in. We get to use those paper dollars. We get to use bank credit. We can write a check. We can withdraw currency. We can take out a loan, which creates the currency, and then write a check to somebody else. But when that currency is created, that is all bank credit. It wasn't created by the Federal Reserve. The banks actually do create that. It's the vast majority of the currency supply, more than 90% of it. But in this case, the Federal Reserve is buying $1 billion bond, but they can't pay the primary dealer directly because the primary dealer cannot have a checking account at the Federal Reserve. Only the member banks of the Federal Reserve System can have a checking account. And this is where that wall in the bank comes in. You use the front of the bank and the Federal Reserve, the back of the bank, there's all the banks paying each other, borrowing from each other, lending to each other at the end of every day, and they do that through these accounts at the Federal Reserve. But when the Federal Reserve buys that $1 billion worth of bonds, they type $1 billion worth of Fed IOUs, bank reserves, into existence, and they pay the reserve account of that primary dealer's bank with the instructions that if I give you $1 billion of bank reserves, I want you to create $1 billion worth of bank credit. So whenever they do quantitative easing, every dollar creates $2. $1 of Federal Reserve, of bank reserves, and $1 of bank IOUs, bank credit, that is credited to the primary dealer's account. And then the primary dealer is happy it got paid for that $1 billion worth of bonds. So that is the mechanics of it. But the point is, this causes all of this currency to build, these bank reserves to build up. There's that wall there. They pile up. In front of that wall, it all gets paid out. And so the primary dealers have it. Then they pay for the bonds that they sold into the market, and it's now in the financial markets, causing when a primary dealer, when Goldman Sachs or J.P. Morgan or B of A Securities, UBS, whichever the primary dealer is, when they get that $1 billion, it goes directly into the financial markets, and it lifts the stock markets and the bond markets. And so that's how the economy was being stimulated directly. And it's the first time in history that they've done this. If you want to learn more about this, and you should, go to ggsr21.com. That's Great Gold and Silver Rush of the 21st Century.com. And click on, and this is free. We don't even ask for an email address. Just go and get it, download it, email it to anybody you want. It's free. Click on online chapters. What you're interested in is chapter 4, Scene of the Crime. So you want to download that, or you can just read it online. Give a man a gun and he can rob a bank, but give a man a bank and he can rob the world. And this is the mechanics of this are all explained in part 2, IOUSA, in anticipation of taxation of the population of the nation. Part 3 shows the $200 billion gift you never intended to give. Well, guess what? And reserves are not required. There's no more required reserves. That $200 billion when I wrote the book is now $500 billion. So let's get back to that animated chart. And now that you understand that these reserves, when they get paid to the banks, hit that brick wall that's in the bank and they just pile up. But to keep them from getting out and causing inflation through other, I don't know all of the processes that go on, but the banks can use these for certain things, and it can cause inflation. So Ben Bernanke decides, well, if we pay them interest on reserves, then it won't leak out. It'll stay in there because it's in the bank's best interest to collect that interest. But that interest is actually coming from you and me, and I'm going to show you that process. And the payments to the Treasury, this will start in 2011. But here is the interest being paid to the banks, and it's calculated, like I said, this times this gives you that. It's pretty simple. And you're going to watch this just explode at certain times. So here we go. 2010. We've got QE 1, 2, and 3, and then the payments to the Treasury come in, and you can see 15, 16, 17, 18 billion, 20, 22, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, and then interest rates start going up 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 billion, 120 billion, 140 billion, and it keeps on going up, and then interest rates fall because of COVID. When the pandemic happened, Jerome Powell panicked, and he created as much as Ben Bernanke had created in QE 1, 2, and 3 in almost no time at all, and it peaked at about $4.2 trillion. But what you see here is as they were creating all of this, Ben Bernanke created a bunch of it, then reserves start to shrink, which means if it's those reserves times 0.2% interest, it was currency raining on the banks, but it wasn't a deluge yet. But that currency, this currency that went to the banks, did not go to the Treasury. It did not help pay down the deficit. And so you get stuck with the bill. So during this whole time, everything that was here means that going all the way back to 2008, going back to here, I wish I had data before 2008 on the payments to the Treasury, because what you would see is this would be every week, this would have been higher. The difference was stolen by Ben Bernanke and given to the biggest banks on earth. So now we're going to take a look at what happens when the pandemic happened. Interest rates were dropped to zero, so the impact that it was having on us was not that much. But then, with all of this currency, it is now, I believe, down around $3.2 trillion. We'll see at the end of this chart, because this was updated just last month for my appearance at Limitless in Dallas, and at the end of August. And so all of this data was accurate. Brought up to date. And when I wrote my book, The Charts in 2002, interest rates were only up like, I don't know where they were, but you'll see in a minute. But they were still fairly low. They had not gone up to 5.25% yet. But in March of 2022, that's where this starts, Powell started raising rates at the fastest pace in history, and here we go. So there, he's raising the rates, 4%, 5%. You can see this explode, 450. Now, this looks like it leveled off. That's just an anomaly in the chart. It didn't. But when you take this over $3 trillion, it's at 3.3, almost 3.4 trillion right now. So when you take this over $3 trillion times 5.4% interest, the amount being paid to the banks it just exploded from 150 billion roughly to where we're up at 483 billion. And if I updated this to today, it would be right about at $500 million, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, but pretty darn close to 500 billion. I'm sorry, not $500 million, $500 billion, 500 billion. And you can see those original payments to the Treasury that you used to be able to see, because the scale of this had to change so drastically, they've gone down to where you can barely even see it because we've changed this scale. But these are the IOUs being written to the Treasury. The Federal Reserve went bankrupt right there, broke, and they owe the Treasury almost $200 billion. But what came out of the difference between, if I had this data going back further, you'd see that the difference of the average that was being paid to the Treasury, once they started doing these payments in 2008, on this interest on those reserves, that difference is all of this that comes out of this part of the timeline, and it only goes negative in September of 2022. So that's like about here. So this 200 billion is it'd be 480 down to about 280. So everything from there up is stuff that was paid to the banks, but was actually owed to the Treasury. But all of this was owed to the Treasury and paid to the banks instead. And since the Treasury has to issue more U.S. Treasuries to cover these payments that were not made to the Treasury under the Federal Reserve Act, it means that you have to make up the difference in the taxes that you pay in the future. The Treasury has to borrow more currency for the government to get by. So the man that won the Nobel Prize in Economics, has crashed the global economy. We just haven't seen the crash yet. It's still out there in the future, but the Federal Reserve is bankrupt and they're in a trap. And the trap is that they can't borrow. People go, well, how can the Federal Reserve get bankrupt? They can just create currency out of thin air. No, they can't. They cannot create currency out of thin air. That does not happen. It never happens. What they do is they create currency by buying something. And that something that they have to buy, according to the Federal Reserve Act, is U.S. Treasuries and now mortgage-backed securities. But those things pay interest. And when they have those, to buy those, they have to increase the bank reserves. And so every time that they try to raise interest rates back up, this is going to go more and more and more negative. This is a trap that they cannot get out of, that Ben Bernanke set, and I believe that this is a death spiral. I don't see any mathematical way that this can work out. It's something that we're seeing right now, the precursor to the end game. And this little red spike right here is the evidence that the end game has begun. And guess what? The biggest banks on earth are the recipients, all on your dime. I want to thank you for watching this, and we will see you next time.